Kia ora koutou, and welcome to this discussion video from ECE Reform focused on ratios, group sizes and space per child. I'm Dr. Mike Bedford, I'm the Executive Officer of ECE Reform, and in case you're not familiar with us as an organisation, ECE Reform is a child advocacy group that was formed specifically to come up with answers to the current problems that we have with the early care and education sector. And I think anyone who's familiar with the sector will know there are certainly problems at the moment. So we're not a protest group, it is pure advocacy. And the idea here is to get the best that we can for children's quality of life and to have a sector that we could be proud of again. So some of the proposals that we have are systems-based proposals, so we're looking at replacement for the licensing system, for example. But this particular video is focused on core regulations that impact on the daily living and learning environments for children, on the ability for teachers to be able to do their jobs well without breaking under stress, which is what's happening at the moment, while still having viability and viable transitions. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? The proposal that we're putting out here is not set in concrete, it's up for discussion. It started off with some frameworks being formed in discussion with advisors and hub leaders in ECE Reform, and then we put a first draft out to our members for comment. There's been quite a bit of backwards and forwards with different people's comments and changing numbers and things like that. And so this is where we've got to at this stage of the discussion. Now we want to put it out to the wider early childhood sector and say, do you think we hit it right? Do you agree with our definition of group size, for example? What about the numbers that we've put into the tables? So two ways that you can respond. You can either email me, and I'll put the address at the end, it's change@ecereform.org. Or of course we'll be putting it out on Facebook pages, so you're welcome to put comments up on Facebook as well. We'd really love to hear from you. I'll just add, by the way, that the makeup of ECE Reform is currently 85% qualified early childhood teachers, and in addition to that we have, I think it's about 5% of our members are centre owners or managers. And we also have parents and grandparents, so very much weighted in the experience of teachers on a day-to-day basis, but also the concerns and experiences of people wider in the sector as well. So I thought it might just be helpful. Also, my own role as Executive Officer, I'm New Zealand's only postgraduate qualified public health specialist for the sector, so we've got that public health look in from me there as well. So I thought it would just be helpful if you knew what our particular makeup was. So a very quick look at what's actually wrong with the sector, what has happened. I mean, obviously one of the things that we can look at is funding, and the funding problems really track back, I would say, to about 2010, when we had funding slashed to the sector. In the middle of 2010, I felt the impact of that because I actually had a design business at the time, and my design business was crashed by the funding cuts because people couldn't afford to pay for long-term design when they were desperately trying to pay their teachers and do the basic maintenance. But things haven't improved much, so we know that we have funding problems. But further back than that, in 2008, I wrote an article with a public health colleague that described the sector as a runaway train. We could see that there were problems down the track, and we were figuring this thing's going to derail sooner or later unless we do something about it. And the things we were looking at particularly were the conditions for children and teachers, particularly ratios, space per child, noise, stress. So what have we got in the overall picture? Well, the really good things we've got in relation to other nations is a relatively high focus on qualified teachers. And we have Te Whariki. And Te Whariki is a jewel. It is a really, really beautiful thing. So we've got these two good things. But our ratios, particularly for children under 3 years old, are unworkable. They are just appalling. We have among the worst indoor space per child among Western nations. It's serious overcrowding, and that produces stress and noise. We have inadequate outdoor space. When we have a situation where children are told to use their walking feet outside, when you can't run when you're 3 years old because it's too dangerous because the space is too small, I think in New Zealand we can do better than that. We're not that crowded a country. We have no group size limits, and we'll talk into that. A lot of countries have group size limits, or jurisdictions have group size limits. We have no real protection against noise. We've also got issues around air pollution with centre location, but those last two we're not going to deal directly with in this video. We're going to focus particularly on the first three of ratios, crowding and group size. So from the outset, when we were looking at ratios and group sizes, we saw these two things as absolutely interconnected, that you have to work both of them together. And that's why you'll see as we move through that our tables for ratios and group sizes it's one table that manages both. They're not treated as separate issues. And that's because ratios and group size have to do with relationships. It has to do with how many people can you cope with relating to, what gives you a sense of family instead of just being lost in the crowd, and how many children are teachers able to develop meaningful relationships with at once. When do you just get overload? Because when you get to overload, if you're simply looking at ratios or group sizes in terms of supervision rather than relationship, you are putting children at serious relational and emotional risk, particularly the infants and toddlers. So we've really put a lot of emphasis on those younger age groups, and that is consistent with international jurisdictions. There were a few little practicalities we had to consider, like what is a reasonable teaching team? If you're looking after babies, it might be nice to have a 1:3 ratio and a group size of 6 with 2 teachers. But actually the better teaching team size would be 3 teachers in ratio, that is, in addition to floating staff. But 3 teachers is better than 2 when you're looking after babies. So that would increase your group size. If you had a 1:3 ratio, that would increase your group size to 9. So that's a practicality we had to consider. And we also had to consider things like, just the management of role fluctuations as well. So just taking a look at some international comparisons here around that concept of group size. I picked up this table from a US organisation, well, it's basically a website, childcare.gov, and this is operated by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And this is intended really to give guideline to states as to what is reasonable in terms of ratios and group size, number of trained teachers that should be present. And so just to give you an example, if you have a look at the second line down, young toddler 1 to 2 years of age. So they're giving a ratio range of 1:3 to 1:6, a group size of not more than 6 to 12, and they're saying in a classroom. Now, I object to the term classroom in the sense for a start, but putting that aside, they're talking about in a room, at least 2 trained teachers. Now, while the ratios don't look particularly brilliant here, 1 to 3, good, 1 to 6, absolutely not good, but the group sizes are small, and that seemed to be quite consistent through most of the legislation that was coming out of the United States. Now, I did find getting information from Europe a wee bit more challenging, but it was interesting to see this little bit of summary information from the DICE report, which is it's a quarterly journal. It actually originates from Germany, and it looks particularly at international regulation comparisons, looks at things like economic policy, social conditions, things like that. And so they've made a note on group sizes and ratios in Europe. And so what they've said is first of all, there's a very broad range, and that's what I'm finding internationally, very broad range of conditions. But they're saying that for 0 to 3-year-olds, the group size ranges from 10 to 14 children. And then for the older children, they didn't define it, but I guess it's over 3s. They give examples of the range from 20 children in Austria and Slovak Republic through to 30 children in France. They note that Poland, for example, maximum group size not yet regulated. That's the case for some other jurisdictions in Europe as well. But what I want to point to here is that regulating group size is a normal thing, if not universal, for legislation all over the world. It's a normal concept. Okay, so going to a bit more detail on ratios, what I've given you here is a table that is really just a sampler of jurisdictions around the world, or really Western nations, particularly the US. And it's not selected for being better or worse. It is quite a random selection. And there's incredible variation. But talking through the table, what you can see on the left-hand side is the list of jurisdictions. So I pop New Zealand at the top there. And then you've got a list of US states, followed by Finland, Denmark, England, Wales, and Australian states. And I think these are reasonable jurisdictions to be making a comparison with. Then across the top you can see the age bands. So that's months, and it's the requirement for children up to that age. And so you'd wonder why there's so many of them. Well, this is actually the way the legislation or statutes were written. So yeah, New York State has a cut-off at 6 weeks. So they're saying 1 to 3 up to 6 weeks, and then after that up to 18 months 1 to 4. Whereas Indiana is not allowing children under 6 weeks to attend. So these are the kinds of things that came into play, breaks at 12, 15, 18 months, 36, 30, all over the show. But just moving along to the next columns, I've indicated how many age bands are in use, and you can see there's a really bizarre one there of Tennessee that had incredibly complex tables, about 11 age groupings. Lots and lots of overlap between them, different combinations is what they seem to go for. But they've given a lot of thought to it. But very common to have 3, 4, 5 age bands. Again, I only found this in the States, but a lot of jurisdictions that had overlap between age bands, which gave you a bit of flexibility as to how you organised. And then in the right-hand column, did they have controls for group size? And very commonly in the States, you've got that 2 to 3 times ratio group size requirement. The overall trend that you can see here is that for children under 3 years old, most of the jurisdictions had better ratios than New Zealand. And I don't think that's remotely surprising, because the 1 to 5 ratio is awful. But when you look at the older age groups, so that's over 3 years old, a lot of jurisdictions were not as good as New Zealand. And so you've got a number of 1 to 11, 1 to 12, 1 to 15 in there. But bear in mind, of course, that we have 1 to 15 for sessional ECE. So a lot depends on the detail in legislation as to what kind of setup they're talking about. And this table doesn't split out that far. But I think this gives an idea that, yeah, New Zealand ratios are not good, and we really need to do some work on this. And also that it's reasonable to think into something that is not as clunky as the two-way split, or possibly even better than the currently flagged three-way split from the ministry. Do we need to go to something that is a little bit more tailored and also allows overlap? So just before we move into the actual tables on ratios and group size that we're proposing, we had first of all deal with the purpose and the definition of group size. What is group size? So first of all, talking about what we're trying to achieve here by limiting group size. And so we've got the statements there that group size limits have got the purposes of limiting social interaction complexity during most of the attendance time, and you'll see that most of the attendance time is reflected in our definition. Limiting the number of children that teachers need to build relationships with. We had the statistic come out in 2020 from the 4020 Child Forum Teacher Survey of 29% of respondents saying they didn't have time to develop relationships with children. And for infant and toddlers, I'm sorry to be so strong about it, but I would regard that as child abuse. It is not okay to have a situation where children go through long days and they don't have an attachment relationship with an adult in the room. That's very, very damaging to a child. So ensuring that all children have secure relationships with adults during the day. So what is group size then? Where we've come to is a definition that we think is actually very, very workable and practical. And so what we're saying is group size is the number of children in a spatially separated group with a specifically allocated group of teachers. So that's the teachers in ratio who are the team for that group of children. And that is applied during 80% of the operational day. So we're not saying, you can't gather everybody together for something special, or maybe you do something different at meal times or whatever. That there's a little bit of flexibility in this, but this is linked to spatially separated, the definition of that. So what we're saying is, look, we've got centres that are not designed for the group sizes that we want to see. How do you address that? So the separation we're suggesting should be a barrier at least 1.5 metres high. The reason for choosing that number is that not only is it above child eye height, but it's also going to provide some sound deadening as well. So if you've got reasonable acoustic treatment on your ceiling, and you've also got partitions that are at that height, then the children can be protected well from that noise bouncing around. It's going to reduce the noise in your room, which is really important. This could be lower. We could say 1.3 metres. So this is where we want feedback on this definition. But what we're not saying is that you have to build walls. So a lot of this could be done with office partitioning, for example. What you can't do with this definition is say, oh, the block table down here, that separates our groups. That's not okay. There has to be visual separation so that the children do not feel that they're part of a big crowd, that this space is their space. Group size doesn't apply outside. That gets way too difficult to manage, and we simply can't reasonably split up the outdoor areas. You run into problems with all sorts of equipment. So not applying it there. And it absolutely does not mean room size or centre size. So you would have multiple groups within one centre. You can have more than one room per group. So please don't mix up room size, centre size when you're thinking of group size. So this is something we'd love to have your feedback on. Did we get it right? Have we pinned that one? Okay, well now we get to the juicy bit that you've all been waiting for. I never thought I'd be referring to tables of ratios being juicy, but here we go. So this is the proposal around ratios and group sizes. And so what we're going to look at first of all, so I should just explain here that the very first consideration that we had is that children's needs and the ability of teachers to be able to cope with those needs is going to change a lot depending on the hours that children are spending. So particularly, the difference between a child attending a 3-hour sessional early childhood education environment, like traditional kindergarten or play centre, that's going to be very different from a child who's there for 10 hours a day. So we have to take that into consideration first of all, and for that reason we've developed 3 tables that are based on the session hours. So it's important to say this is not individual child attendance. You don't have to work around the tables for an individual child. It's about how long are you operating the session for. What that means is that each centre will only be working from one table. So if you're doing up to 4 hours a day, 4 hours a day for a session, that's going to be on the next slide. That's sessional ECE. The next one up that we've got at the bottom of this slide is maximum 7 hours a day. So that's basically school day, matches to what kindergartens are doing for the most part at the moment. And then long day, which is maximum 11 hours. Now, I just need to mention a term here. I'm referring to long daycare when I'm talking about that. And there are people who object to the use of the term daycare or childcare. But the reality is that in New Zealand, what we try to do for most children is to provide early childhood education in the context of long daycare. Early childhood education is what we do, what we provide. The environment into which we put it is a long day for a child. It is long daycare. And so we've got to recognise and talk about both. We can't start calling, well, we can't continue to try to call long daycare intrinsically early childhood education. It's not that simple. And for a child, a lot of children have completely had it by 8 hours, let alone 10 or 11. Now, again, looking at those maximum hours there, why choose 11 hours for long daycare? That's the longest that I know of children attending at the moment. But there was a problem here. I don't want to see children in long daycare for 11 hours a day. But if we made it 10 hours, something that was pointed out by our Auckland people is that we've got parents who are doing long commutes. Now, what that means is that if you limited it to 10 hours, it might mean that a child who could have been attending a suburban centre, maybe with some decent green space, will now be bundled into a car for a long drive in the morning. They may be spending their day in a centre that's not as good. It could be in a commercial industrial zone, and then they get bundled into the car for a long drive at the end of the day. And we've disadvantaged that child as an unintended consequence of shortening the hours. So we don't want to do that, and so that's why it stayed at 11. And then 7 hours, of course, it matches to what kindergartens are doing, and we also wanted to say, okay, we need, if you're operating 6 hours, you still need a little bit of flexibility there. So we think we've hit that bracketing right. So now looking at how the tables are structured. So for the long day, we went for 4 age bands. But what you'll see in the middle there is there's 18 to 30 months and there's 24 to 36 months. So that gives an overlap, that gives you a little bit of flexibility as to how you work your age groups. The other key thing here is that our cut-offs are not at 12 months or 24 months, they're 18 months and 18 months and 30 months. It's 1.5 years and 2.5 years. And that's what's fallen out as the best division point from the teacher conversation. Sorry, we do have the 2 years in the 24 to 36 month band, but the reason for using 18 months, something that I found actually, some WHO data, is that at 12 months about half of the children will be walking without assistance, and at 18 months that's about 99%. And for that and other developmental reasons, if you're looking at what's your ratio requirement, we said, okay, really under 18 months you need that 1 to 3 and you need your smallest group size. Then from 1.5 years we bumped it up to 1 to 4, up to 2.5 years. But that can move up again if your youngest child is 24 and you're going up to 36 months, and that's a 1 to 6. Then 3 years and over, we've put that at 1 to 8 as our target, and the maximum group size of 32. Now, the comment from teachers 32, even that's a bit of a stress, that's a big group, but we're also trying not to be too draconian with this and cut it down too far. So the children over 3 years old can cope with that slightly bigger group. What we don't want to be seeing anymore is children spending 10 hours a day or so in groups of 40 or 50 or something. So coming back further down to the youngest groups, in the under 3 age group, we've set the maximum group size as a 3-teacher in ratio team, because that's the practical number of teachers you need to handle different things going on. And so that produces a maximum group size of 9 for your babies, 12 for your toddlers up to 30 months, 18 to 30, and 18, maximum group size 18 for 24 to 36 months. Then we step up to a 4-teacher core team. So remember, you'd also have your floating teachers you support for breaks and things like that. But core 4-teacher team, which gives that 32-child group. Now, what's the difference for the kindergarten group, the maximum of school day? Well, in the younger age groups, so that's the under 30 or up to the 24 to 36 month band, quite honestly, your demands are going to be pretty much the same. There isn't a good rationale to say you can have bigger group size or not as good ratios for that age group. But if we shift for a moment to the 3 years and over, what you can see is that matches to current kindergarten size at 40 children, but with shifting the ratio to a 1 to 8, that means you're going to have 5 teachers instead of 4. And remember, all of this has got to be funded. We're not just saying to kindergartens or equivalent centres, hey, you're just going to have to pull another teacher out of somewhere. This is obviously got to be funded. But when you've got younger children, you really do need that slightly smaller group size, better ratio. Now, part of my history, I ran the Wellington Regional Public Health Unit for the early childhood centres for many years, and certainly in the 90s, when all kindergartens were operating sessional, the youngest children that were attending were 2 years 8 months in the Wellington region, and those are children who were doing this shorter afternoon sessions for 3 days a week. And it wasn't until you were in the older group that you did 3-hour sessions 5 days a week. So, if you're looking at a 7-hour day for a 2.5-year-old, you've got some pretty serious demands in there. So that's why we just shifted that ratio back a little bit. That means your 5-teacher team, you're now 35 children. And then, of course, it shifts to a 3-teacher team if you're going lower than that. And I guess this does mean we're flagging that, you see, the kindergarten buildings generally were never designed for very young children. So for those age groups, you really need more purpose-built facilities for that age group. So with that explanation behind us, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the sessional, but what you can see is that we do have not as tight ratios and bigger group sizes in here, unless you're down to the various youngest children again. If you're looking after babies, then yep, you're going to need a 1 to 3 ratio and you don't want a big group. But once you get up to that traditional kindergarten age, the 3 years and over is set as it once was, 1 to 15, maximum group size 45, 3 teachers. That's what used to be. 3-teacher kindergarten was 45 children, but it was sessional. We've dropped that back to a 1 to 10 if you're looking at 30 to 36 months, maximum group size 40. And we think that this is a reasonable setting for that shorter time where it's just focused on the action, on the learning. It's not trying to provide that full daycare service. Okay, so of course that was talking about age grouped centres, But now we want to shift on to talking about mixed age centres. And this is really important because there's a lot of development happening in the space at the moment, and I think it's got a lot of positive potential. I'll just mention, by the way, in none of this are we talking about parent-led. It's all teacher-led, because we wouldn't go to the parent-led without working very closely alongside play centre federations. So yeah, these are totally teacher-led examples. So one of the main considerations when you're looking at mixed age is that for any group size or ratio, you need to consider the proportion of children who are very young, because they will have higher demands on the teachers than the older children. So the way we've approached this is to say, well, let's take two scenarios. One is the scenario where you take children of all ages, and the second one, so that's the second table, is where you say, well, what say we limited enrolments to children over 1 year of age? So does that allow you to shift your ratios and your group size a bit? We think it does. So that's why the two tables. Now, we did try generating tables that were based on percentages of children, but it really got kind of messy. So what we've gone for instead of age banding. The first table is based on a maximum 1 to 5 ratio, and the second table maximum 1 to 6 ratio. Both of the tables work nominally on not having more than 50% of your children under 2.5 years old. And then we've looked at how many, for the first table, how many babies could you reasonably have as a proportion within that group size. So that's why you've got your columns here. On the left hand side, you've got your group size, then you've got the maximum number of children within that group under 12 months of age, and then including that number, the maximum number of all children under 2.5. So as an example, if you look at the line for a group size of 11 to 15, including babies, the maximum number of all children under 2.5 is 7. Of course, 50% would be 7.5, and that gets messy, and you'd have to clean up afterwards and stuff. But so we're not going to go there. But so 7 there and 2 babies, and that would be for a core teaching team of 3 in ratio. The biggest group size for that table is 25, so it'd be 25 child group, 5 teachers. I'll just mention here that we've got to remember that group size is not room size, and it is not centre size. So hold to that group size definition we gave earlier. Coming over to the other table, we've got a little bit of a shift up, because that's 1 to 6 ratio, and that brings your group sizes up. And so your maximum group size there is 30, and maximum number of children under 2.5 is 15. So we think this is giving a reasonably flexible arrangement and workable numbers. I'll just mention also that, of course, because it's group size, you could have a centre, for example, that had one group of 20 children with babies and another group of 25 children with babies, for a total centre size of 45. But yeah, so you can mix and match a bit, and this lends itself to the idea of the village concept, which I think is a great idea. So that means you can have, for example, 5 25 child houses for 125 child centres. That's a big centre, but the children are not experiencing that big group, and they stay with their home group through those years. They're not moving from one room to another, from one group of teachers to another. They're not being split up from their friends. It means that they stay with that group through their early years. There's a lot of stability in it, as well as all the advantage of the tuakana taina relationships. But anyway, to talk more about this, and also to get an opinion on the appropriateness of the mixed age ratios, I'm going to move into an interview with Rick Foree, who at the moment is developing a centre in Upper Hutt that is exactly like this. It's 24 child pods, and the children stay with their home pod and I'll let him explain what they're doing with the ratios. Well, we've got a quick little spot here now with Rick Fro-ing. Thanks so much for coming in, Rick, and it's great for me to be able to host you because you've hosted me in the past.
Thanks, Matt.
So many of you will know Rick, but Rick's got a really solid history with centre development and also, of course, Conscious Collective and hosting Play to Heal the World, and is now doing a really exciting development in Upper Hutt that is based around two concepts, if I can get this one right. One is that you've got a limited group size by actually having a village of separate buildings. I love the village concept of centre design, where you can have the economy of scale, in this case of a 96 child centre, but the children don't experience great big groups. They've got their own little home pod of 24, and also running on mixed age, where it's much more of that sense of family. So not only have you got the tuakana taina, but also as children grow older within that context, they're not being shifted from room to room, group to group, teacher to teacher. They're with the same group, their same friends as they grow up. So I think it's really exciting. But what I'd like to get from you, Rick, is just a comment on how you worked your ratios and group size. What brought you to those numbers? Perhaps if you just tell us the numbers you're working with and how you came to that.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Yes, this is I think the 10th centre development I've been a part of, and it feels like the culmination of years of thinking and reflection and leading to this idea of home pods, which you've actually had a significant influence on our thinking, and creating a mixed age to really do away with the transitions. Now, one of the things that I noticed in many of the centres that we were building or that I've attended is that it seems to be with the trend of increasing numbers, increasing group sizes, that's where a lot of the complexity lies. And I realized that human group sizes, human populations or groups, really follow a very similar trend to like Metcalfe's network laws, which states that every additional node or every additional person really exponentially adds complexity to that system. So that means that for every additional person, there can be an exponential complexity that's added to that system. So you might have, an increase of 16 children to 20, and you think, oh, it's only 4 children. But actually, from a complexity point of view, that's doubled the complexity in the room. So I knew, okay, we have to get the group sizes down if we're going to address things like noise, and emotional overwhelm, especially with the increase of neurodivergence and that we're seeing in a lot of our centres. So we knew that getting group size, decreasing group size, and also increasing the adults in the room is going to play a really significant part in increasing the quality of care that we can provide. So in our model, we've settled on having what we call home pods, which are when the child arrives at 6 months old, this is their home pod, and they're going to be with us until they leave 5 or 6. And we have 24 children per home pod, and we have 2 rooms, a living room and a lounge, that, to give some sort of sense of if they want to have a quiet space, a space that maybe for space for non-crawlers, there's a really safe space for that. But if they want to be more loud and they want to kind of have a bit more robust interaction, there's a space for that as well. And between the rooms, the way that we're staffing it is we're going for only 3 children under 12 months old, and with 1 adult, and then we're going for 1 to 4 ratio for the additional under 2s, if we wanted to call it that. And then we've got a 1 to 8 ratio for the over 2s, or 1 to 7 ratio, sorry, for the over 2s. So we've got 24 mixed age. That's how I've broken it down, because that's our traditional lens of how we kind of came to how many teachers in this space. And so we've got 4 teachers full-time plus an additional support staff. So 5 teachers in this space, 24 children, and they will operate really as quite an independent unit, a unit that can cover their own breaks, a unit that will really independently connect with their community. And so it's all about decreasing complexity rather than seeing it as a center of 90 children, which you mentioned. We're really seeing it as 3 or 4 small centers that run reasonably autonomously and connected to each other.
I was interested to see that from the first sort of ideas around that, we said, well, let's hatch some tables and see what they look like, and then we'll throw them around.
That's right.
That the result of that, after discussion with a few of our advisors and hub leaders within ECE Reform, and then coming out to wider to our membership, is that what you're doing is very similar to where we got to. So I thought that was actually quite exciting that we managed to come up with something that was very similar.
Yeah, for sure. I do see some limitations in our model, I think, especially around, we would love to have ratios. We would love to have 5 staff in that space for 25 children. I think that ideally, if you think about operations during the day, with teachers being taken off the floor with care moments, through changing children or putting them to sleep, manning the outside space, inside all the rooms, really, we know that we're going to be constrained. So we're going to work within limits. We have a vision. We do believe we can pull off, but it's still going to put stress on the system. And I think, and that's really at the edges of early childhood. Like, we are really, really working with the funding we've got to try and stretch it as far as what we can already. And so it's imperative that if we want this kind of quality care, which we're trying to prove that we can have, that the Ministry of Education jumps on board and actually says, yes, we're willing to fund quality care. And that it's not a huge amount. It's just an additional staff and over 25. And I think the children and the kaiako are worth investing into.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, because we, in our first sort of iteration, looked at 1 to 6 for a group that had babies, and to 1 to 7 for a group that didn't have anyone under 12 months. But in discussion, that got dropped down to say, well, it's still going to be a bit of a stress. So we shifted to 1 to 5 if you have babies, and 1 to 6 if all your children are over 12 months. And so it sounds as if that's really where you're going to, as being, this is where we'd like to be. But all of our proposals around ratios and group size and so on, everything needs to be funded properly. So yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is, if you had the funding, then that would match that kind of proposal.
100%, it would match it, and it would, I think, really adequately fund quality care that we've all been after. And I think that would make a massive difference for how, it'll help the sector really pivot into something that is workable.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Really encouraging. So, yeah, look, thanks so much for the comments on that, Rick. And so what we're going to be doing, of course, is putting it out to the big wide sector now and see what happens. But, all the best for that project in Upper Hutt. Sounds really exciting. And as I've said, I'm itching to come and have a look at it. I'll catch you again soon on that one. But, yeah, thanks so much for coming in on this one.
Look forward to seeing you there, Mike. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now, of course, as I've mentioned before, we can't get through in one go. If you can say the immediate question is, okay, all very well, but where are the teachers going to come from? We have a massive teacher shortage. And the awful, awful irony of the situation is that the teacher shortage has been generated by the failure to address exactly these things: ratios, space per child, group size, the noise, the stress, the inability to cope. These are major reasons for teachers leaving the sector. And I can say that, as a person who's spoken to many, many, many teachers about the reasons they've left, not one of them said that it was pay. And saying that, we have every sympathy for teachers needing to be better paid, support for properly funded pay parity, not the problem we have with that at the moment, but it was these conditions that are hurting children and driving teachers out that's taken us to where we are now. So how do you get more teachers in the system? Well, one thing, of course, is train teachers, but for teachers to train and stay, you have to say, well, at the end of your 3 years training, you're going to be working in something worth working in, not something that's going to break you, as the current system can do. But there's another factor here, and it's a consideration that's driven this transitional table. So there are a lot of teachers who specialise and work with the under 2 age group, and the under 2 age group is where the change in ratios is absolutely the most critical, and the need for group size control is the most critical. So what we've done in the table is we've said, when this legislation comes in to change this, the immediate change is we get rid of that terrible 1:5 ratio and its maximum 1:4. This has to be funded, so not without funding. And maximum group size 12. Remember, group size is not centre size. So group size 12. And I'm going to comment on this in a minute, but that was done with the consideration that this in itself may bring teachers back. But I'll get another opinion on that one. Other things remain the same at that point. Then after 18 months, you improve the ratios for the 2 to 3, the toddler age group, and we bring that down to 1:7 ratio. And I'll just go back. In that first immediate change, the maximum group size is 40. I don't think there's any excuse to have a group size over 40. With the exception of sessional ECE. That's the only space where I think it's okay to have a group size more than 40. So 40 is the limit there. For over 2, 12 is the limit under 2. But then after 18 months, your maximum group size is 12, 21, 40, ratios 1:4, 1:7, 1:10. And so that gives us that transitional move. As we've started to improve conditions, we can start to bring teachers back. And then at the end of 3 years, we would be shifting to the tables that you've just seen. But anyway, so that you get a break from me talking again, our second special guest star is Helen van der Merwe, who's one of the advisors for ECE Reform, and I'll be putting a question to Helen around that practicality of saying we think we can bring teachers back with that under 2 move. Right, well, thanks so much, Helen, for joining us. So for people watching, this is Helen van der Merwe, who may be known to a number of you. Helen is very experienced as an early childhood teacher and centre manager, and she's also been an incredible advocate for children as well. She's one of our very valued advisors for ECE Reform. And as you will have just seen, we're proposing a transition from where we are now through to where we would like to be for ratios and group size, because we can't get there all in one go. So what we've said, and in fact I think this needs to happen immediately, is that we've got to get rid of that 1:5 ratio, the terrible 1:5 ratio for children under 2 that is unmanageable and damaging for children. But then there is the problem of where are the teachers going to come from? So the suggestion here is that we get rid of that 1:5 ratio. We introduce a maximum group size of 12 children. So that's 3 teachers with a 12-child group if they're under 2 years old. And so, Helen, the question I wanted to put to you, because I thought you had really valuable insight on this one, my thought was that if we did that, I know there are a lot of teachers who specialise in the under 2 age group, and I was thinking, I reckon we would have teachers come back, but is that true? Can you give us a comment on that one?
Oh, absolutely. Just from experience, what I've noticed is services that provide smaller group sizes do attract more quality teachers. We've had a job posting out a couple of months ago, and we attracted quite a few qualified teachers within our infants age group, because we have that smaller group sizes. We do value the qualified teachers within that group size. you get a lot more nurture and care within the group size. So definitely there will be a huge attraction for infant and toddler teachers to come back into the workforce with smaller group sizes.
Yeah, that's great to hear. It sounds as if we can just solve that problem of the conditions that have been driving teachers out. There are plenty of teachers who want to work in the sector, but we've just got to make the conditions right for them. Do you think we're sort of hitting the balance right there? I mean, I know that pay has been a significant issue, but the ratios.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Oh, look, thanks so much, Helen. I just, because I'm not actually a teacher myself, it's essential for what we're doing that we have that voice. So, really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And, always value your input. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, that was ratios and group size. And as I've said, we want to get your comments back. Please let us know what you're thinking on this one. So now we want to finish off. This will be relatively brief. On indoor space per child and outdoor space per child. And frankly, our indoor space per child is gross overcrowding. Children, we already had a bad standard up until 2008 at 2.5 square metres per child clear floor space. But then in 2008, there was a sleight of hand wording change that removed the word furniture. So instead of clear of furniture, fixtures and fittings, it was now just clear of fixtures and fittings. Furniture was now in the count, and that would have taken about 10% of children's space away from them when it was already crowded. And I think that's actually been one of the tipping points that really started to hurt after 2008. But looking at international jurisdictions, with that explanation of that wording change, you can see there's two columns in this table. And so the first one is the number of square metres that they state in the legislation. But different jurisdictions word it differently. So for some of them it's clear floor space, for some of them it's free of fixtures and fittings, or equivalent wording. So in that right-hand column, you've got the number that equates to the New Zealand standard, so it enables us to make a real comparison. And what that means is that if you run your eye down the column, you'll see New Zealand pre-2008. And that has 2.5 square metres per child, which equates to 2.75 now. And that means that New Zealand, with its 2.5, is sitting well down that table. So we actually came 29th out of 34 jurisdictions when you look at it that way. And that's, so you haven't got 34 lines there, by the way, but you'll note that we've got 11 US states, 7 US states with the same measurements. So not doing well. So again, as we've said, we can't get there in one go. Aside from anything else, increasing indoor space is not, for most places, going to be done by increasing the size of the building. It's going to be done by reducing the roll. And so that has to be funded. Again, all of this has to be funded. And if the government doesn't fund these things, by the way, we're just looking at the crash of the sector. I don't see there's any option. We cannot keep going as we are. And it's hurtful to children to keep going as we are. But the end game in this one is that after 3 years, we're at the Australian standard, 3.5 square metres per child. Now, that's done with keeping our wording the same. It's actually easier to manage clear of fixtures and fittings than it is clear of furniture, because furniture is such a variable thing. So that seems sensible wording, but we've got to make the numbers work. So 3.5 square metres, that's for existing centres and new centres. But then for existing centres, you can't just suddenly dispose of your children somewhere. What are you going to do? So there's a wait time of 6 months, and that's to allow a roll to drop so that you can increase your space per child by 10%. So that's a roll drop of 10%. So that gives 2.75 square metres, which is the same as children used to have before 2008. It's just getting their space back that was frankly stolen from them. So then after 18 months, you're moving to 3 square metres, and then after 3 years, you get to 3.5. But for new centres, the immediate start point is 3 square metres per child. And one of the reasons for that is not to create too much of a disparity between new centres and existing ones, because that could unreasonably disadvantage existing centres. So, like to hear your thoughts on that one, but that's the rationale. Now, outdoor space is effectively pegged to indoor space because, again, I mean, most centres are not going to be increasing their land area. So, what it means is that the Australian standard is 7 square metres per child. And so they've done the same thing. The outdoor space is double the indoor space. And so after 6 months, it's 2.75 inside and 5.5 outside. After 18 months, 3 inside, 6 outside. And after 3 years, 3.5 inside and 7 outside. Now, just for comparison, I have personally done outdoor area designs, long-term designs for about 30 early childhood centres that were almost all kindergartens and play centres. And the typical outdoor area for a New Zealand traditional New Zealand kindergarten or play centre is 15 to 25 square metres per child, because that's what you're going to do if you're just designing for children instead of saying, okay, financially how's this going to sit, okay? So if you design for children, you're going to be doing 15 to 25. Recognise we're not going to get there. But what it means is that 7 square metres per child is tiny. That's smaller than any of the spaces I worked with. 10 square metres per child is still really constrained. But that's double what we have now, which is just 5 square metres per child is frankly awful. So in this situation, we're saying for new centres, you go straight to 10 square metres per child because we don't want to see any more centres developed with little tiny outdoor areas. So that's the rationale here. And so we think we've got a reasonable stepwise progression and a reasonable treatment of that balance on new centres. So thank you so much for working all the way through to this point, to listening through the whole presentation. There was a lot of information in there. And so we really do want your feedback. As we said, this is not set in concrete. This is the best shot from discussions so far. I want to emphasise that there is no intention at all to either harm centre owners or to be financially impractical in this. It has to be funded. But at the moment, the funding for the sector is simply inadequate to make the sector safe for children. We have to make it something which means that, yeah, your first 5 years can actually be enjoyable. So that's the goal, quality of life for children, a sustainable arrangement that says we don't crash the teaching workforce again, and that we're realistic about what it costs to have non-parental care and education for the number of hours that we've chosen to do it for. We have to be realistic. So email me, put your comments up on Facebook, and that will guide the next iteration of this. And then we really want to move on it and take it to government and say, okay, people, no mucking about, no waiting a long time for a very slow review process from the ministry. We've got to move on this thing now. We've got to move fast because it's absolutely urgent. Thanks again for your time.